The Independent Electoral Commission says it needs millions of rand for PPE to organise registration for next year's local government elections. This is to adhere to COVID-19 safety protocols. The IEC says it would have to redirect funds from other areas to protect its staff. It's expected to start conducting by-elections in 95 wards across the country next month. IEC's Deputy Chief Electoral Officer, Mawethu Mosery, joins us now. Thank you very much, Mr. Mosery. We appreciate your time. So registrations for next year's local government elections are looming. How are you preparing for this important process amid the pandemic?
Good evening, and we are indeed preparing for the general election of local government, which we expect to take place from about the 4th of August next year, which gives us just about 9 months to prepare for it. Obviously, registration of voters will have to happen at least 3 months before the 4th of August. That gives us the month of May, June for the registration. And we have to protect both our personnel that assist us at voting station, and we also have to protect the voters in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic that the country and the global community is dealing with. In the main is to avoid the transmission of the virus at the voting stations. And in that, we have to ensure social distancing, the wearing of masks, and we also have to ensure that we sanitize in all the steps of voter registration when they take place at our voting stations. And therefore, our preparation, and continuously advised by the Department of Health, is underway, and we are confident that we would be able to manage this space in the cloud of the pandemic.
Mr. Mosery, you've indicated that the redirecting of funds may be necessary in order to purchase this vast amount of PPE for registrations as well as the local government elections. Where would those funds be redirected from? And would that result in possible weakening of other areas or facets of the IEC?
Definitely, we would not weaken the quality of the election. The quality of the election is obviously measured by the extent of accuracy in the processes. Secondly, the compliance with the prescripts in our environment. And more importantly, the value-laden elements of the election process, which is transparency, the felt and seen fairness amongst all competitors in an election. So we would not compromise any of that. If we talk redirecting some of our funding to provide for protective clothing or elements that we need, it may mean we save on certain functions that we normally hold, and also save in other operations of the Electoral Commission in order for us to make the appropriate budget available for the procurement of PPEs.
How will campaigning by political parties take place, given that social gatherings are problematic?
Well, we did have a problem with social gatherings, especially during the higher levels of our lockdown, where gatherings were prohibited. And hence, we were of the view and approached the Electoral Court on the delay of elections, because we said it was not possible to have free campaigning for political parties. But with the country being on level 1 and some measure of gatherings are allowed, it is possible for political parties to go on with their campaigns. Yes, they still have to keep certain protocols in place, such as wearing of masks, and social distancing, but it is now possible for political parties to campaign freely across all the areas that have by-elections. And to this extent, we've not received any complaints from political parties having difficulties to campaign. Obviously, we're seeing a number of campaigns going on to digital platforms and other social media platforms in order for the parties to access voters. And on our part, we've also moved into the same space for our voter information and voter education programs, just to ensure that South African citizens participating in by-elections next week are sufficiently informed so that they can make their choices from an informed basis.
We know that gatherings are allowed, but whether they are advised or not is an entirely different matter. I'm sure you will have seen in the news that a possibility of a second wave is being discussed by both government and their scientific advisors. Are you in any way worried about voter turnout, given the scope of the pandemic globally? For instance, looking at the US elections this week, they've resorted to mail-in ballots. Is that a possibility here in South Africa?
We have been observing various regions and various countries in the conduct of their elections under the pandemic environment. And certainly in the early part of this year, we saw a low voter turnout. But in this second part of the year, there is an increase in voter turnout. Yes, postal voting is a possibility, but it is subject to fairness. It is also subject to securing that process. It is also subject to just an element of assuring transparency that those postal votes would not be interfered with. And to that extent, our engagements with the postal service of the country is still at its early stages. And we hope, as we discuss and prepare for the general elections next year, it's an area that we will sufficiently explore and also consult political parties to gain their confidence if we were to use that route. Obviously, in the United States elections, they used postal services and pre-voting system to a greater extent, which may not be possible in our environment because our current legislative framework provides for special votes only as a mechanism for early voting, but early voting, as we saw in the United States, is not provided for in our law. Secondly, postal voting is also not provided for in our legislative framework, so there would need to be an amendment of the law to provide for that.
All right, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. That was the IEC's Deputy Chief Electoral Officer, Mawethu Mosery.